someone in your life that you trust? Totally trust. Do you have someone in your life that you would literally be willing to put your life in their hands? I hope you do. Not everyone could say they do, but I hope you do. I was making a bit of list of those people in my life during the week, and I actually realised I've got quite a long list. There's actually a big bunch of people who, I might not know some of them very well, might not be related to some of them. I've got a big group of people in my life where I say, you know what? I totally trust that person. I would be willing to tell that person anything. I would be willing to put my life in someone else's hands. And maybe I'm a bit lucky in that, but I've also made some decisions to trust other people, and I've tried to be a kind of person that is trustworthy to other people. You know, those things often sort of go two ways. And it got me thinking about, what does it take to trust someone totally? You know, what are the things that have to happen between you and someone else? What had to happen between me and those people on my list in order for me to trust them totally? And one thing I thought was it probably takes a fair bit of time. You know, there's just a certain amount of sort of time in relationship that it takes to build that kind of trust. I thought, but it also takes, at least for me, it takes a lot of good communication. You know, trust is built up by the communication, the relationship that I have with people. I thought, you know, if I text someone, if I text Steve this week and asked him for help with a life-changing decision, if I text Steve and said, Steve, I've got this really big decision that I need to make, can you help me? If I got back from Steve just, yeah, what, right? You know, like I'd be, do you know what I mean? I'd be, you know, do I really want to go the next step and unload with him? If I got back a message from Steve that said, hey, I'd love to help, call me. Right? I'm a lot more likely, at least for me, more likely to kind of go, look, I'll go the next step because I'm getting something back from Steve. Do you know what I mean? Because he's talking. If Steve didn't respond to the text at all, am I likely to send him a second text, or am I likely to go, you know, I'll go try someone else? I don't know, does that kind of make sense? You know, communication is a big part of trust, right? We're in episode 2 of a series we're calling Women in the Bible. We're saying there's lots of kind of famous people in the Bible, and lots of them, maybe most of them, seem to be men. Some of the names you might have heard, people like Moses or Noah or David, Abraham, Paul, they're all men. All of the disciples that surround, those 12 disciples that surrounded Jesus, they were all men. Jesus himself was a man. That's a good question to ask. Where are all the women in this story, right? So in this series, we're going to dig into the lives of some of the women in the Bible, some of the really significant women in the Bible. There's actually a lot of really significant women in the Bible. And we're going to ask, what do their lives and their stories teach us? What can we learn from their life and their leadership? Last week we began the series talking more generally about women in the Bible and women in the church. We said, like, before we get into the lives of individual women, let's kind of take a step back and talk about the role of women and the place of women generally in the Bible and in the church. And we saw that right from the beginning, right from literally the first page in the Bible in Genesis 1, we learned that God created men and women. Number one, he created them both in his image, both men and women made in the image of God. That God created men and women to rule over the earth together in a kind of partnership. And we saw that God created men and women differently. Men and women are not the same. They're created to be different. And we learnt that when sin entered the world, sin broke the partnership between men and women. And all of a sudden, instead of partnership, there was rivalry. And instead of kind of working together, equality and working together, there was sort of, you know, higher and lower. And we saw how women came to be second-class citizens in lots of parts of the Bible. They were shut out of parts of society, and they were definitely shut out of parts of the church, shut out of parts of spirituality and life with God. And then we saw how Jesus came into the world and gave value and significance back to the women that he encountered. Jesus went out of his way to spend time with women, to include women, to teach women, and to value women in a way that no one in his culture and his society was doing at the time. Jesus showed the world that women mattered to him, and Jesus showed the world that women mattered to God. So this week we're going to jump into the life of one of the most famous women in all the Bible. In fact, she's so famous, she has a whole book of the Bible named after her. But she wasn't born into an important family. We don't know anything about her background. There's nothing about her background that would tell us that this woman was going to be special. She never preached a sermon. She never fought a battle or won a war. As far as we know, she never had kids. At least not in this story. But Esther's courageous leadership became legendary. Her trust in God and her willingness to stand up for people around her makes her one of the most famous people in the Bible. So if you've got a Bible, open it and let's jump into her story. As always, there's Bibles at the back of the room. Grab one if you want one. Now, I know Esther's a hard book to find. It's in about the first sort of third or so, about a third of the way through your Bible. If you're flicking through, it comes after the books of Kings and Chronicles. They're big books. It comes after that, but before the book of Psalms, which is another big book. Use a table of contents if you've got one, and it's totally okay to cheat off the person next to you and find where Esther is. The book of Esther, if you've never read the book of Esther, it's totally cool because we're going to do that this morning. But the book of Esther is really interesting because the entire book is one long story. Begins at the first page, ends at the end. The book of Esther is one long story. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to start at the beginning of the story, and we're going to take a speed read through the entire story of Esther. And then we're going to come back and ask ourselves, okay, that's the story. What can we learn out of the story? Not that kind of speed read. I know what you're thinking. So let's find Esther chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to start right at the top. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. I looked at a couple of translations for this story, and I think the New Living Translation just makes things sort of flow and read a little bit easier. So, Esther chapter 1, verse 1. These events, everything you're about to read, these events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia. Some books will say, some versions of the Bible will say from India to Cush, which is an ancient word for what we now call Ethiopia. So a quick history lesson. Esther lived about 480 BC, about 480 years before the birth of Jesus. She was an Israelite or a Jew. Two words mean the same thing. She was an Israelite or a Jew. Means she was part of God's people. But she finds herself living in the city of Susa, which is the capital city of Persia, which today is in the middle of the country that we would call Iran. She's living there because 100 years or so before she was born in 586 BC, the Babylonians invaded Israel, the country where she and her, well, she didn't live, but where her ancestors were living. They took over Jerusalem. They killed everyone who was important. But they took a bunch of the poor people, like in chains, they took them back to their homeland in Babylon. 50 years after that, so now we're talking 539 BC, the Persian Empire defeated the Babylonian Empire and took over them and took over their people. And so that's how when Esther's born, she's born in the Persian Empire in the middle of their capital city, as I said, about 480 BC. That's where this whole story takes place. In chapter 1, story of Esther begins with King Xerxes holding a massive party. And when I say massive party, 180 days long worth of party. Verse 10, yes, some of you want to be there. Verse 10, on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was high in spirits because of the wine, he's drunk. You'll find this is a theme for this guy in the Bible, in this story. Xerxes is drunk and he tells the 7 eunuchs, his servants around him who attended him, he says, bring Queen Vashti with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's orders to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. And so the king kicks Queen Vashti out of the palace and out of his life, and we never hear of her again. But that makes King Xerxes queenless. And so chapter 2 begins with King Xerxes holding a kingdom-wide beauty pageant to find a new queen. And he sends messages out and he says, all the young girls, all the women, we're going to have this big beauty pageant and the winner will be the new queen. And that's where we first meet a guy called Mordecai. He's a Jew, another one of these people who've been taken from their homeland. We meet Mordecai and his young cousin Esther, who he looks after. And here's where we run into the first of a number of amazing coincidences, right? In this whole book, you're going to see again and again and again all these amazing coincidences that happen in the book of Esther. Because Mordecai convinces Esther that she should take part in the beauty pageant, and she wins, right? What are the chances of that? Right, all the girls in 127 provinces from all across the world enter a beauty pageant, and she wins. And all of a sudden, poor little nobody Esther is the queen of Persia. But she doesn't tell anyone she's Jewish. Right, you go hold that fact. That's going to become really important later in the story. No one knows that she's a Jew. And chapter 2 then ends with another amazingly coincidental story. This is verse 21. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, that's where he sort of hung out, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, there should be more children named Bigthana. I'm just putting it out there, right? Take note of that, right? Yeah, there you go. Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards, they were guards at the door of the king's private quarters. They became angry at King Xerxes and they plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and he gave the information to Queen Esther. Esther then told the king about it, and she gave Mordecai credit for all of this. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. That was the way they kind of killed people, pretty nasty, but that's the way it was done. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. What a coincidence. Mordecai's just in the right place at the right time to hear about this assassination plot, and he personally saves the king from assassination. This is another story. File this away in your mind. This story will become really important later in the story. Chapter 3 introduces us to the other main character in the story, a guy named Haman. Haman was a royal official. Verse 1 says, sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman. He promoted him over all the over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the whole empire. Verse 2, all of the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, because the king had commanded that to be so. But Mordecai, remember Mordecai, but Mordecai refused to bow down or show him any respect. Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him any respect, he was filled with rage. How dare he? But he'd learned about Mordecai's nationality. He'd learned in asking around that Mordecai was a Jew. And so he decided it was not enough to lay his hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Haman's really ticked off and he wants to get rid of Mordecai, but he thinks, I'm not just going to kill, I'm going to kill all his people. That'll learn him a lesson, right? And so Haman hatches this plan. He asks the king, this is the story. He asks the king for permission to hold a kingdom-wide day of execution. When anyone, on one day it'll be totally lawful for anyone to kill any Jews that they know who are hanging around them and they don't like, right? There'll be one day when anyone can do this, no problems. And the king, the drunken king, goes, yeah, great idea, let's do it. And so the king and Haman roll a dice, randomly choose a day about 6 months or so in advance and say, that's the day. The king writes a letter, like an order, like a law, and it gets sent out through the whole kingdom. So imagine you're sitting at home and all of a sudden someone bangs up a notice in your town and says, in 6 months, there's going to be a Kill the Jews Day. Everyone get on it. It's going to be a heap of fun, right? Chapter 4 begins with Jews across the kingdom in mourning. Right? Because the Jews, they're sitting at home thinking, man, this is going to go bad for us, right? But Esther's living palace life, right? She has no idea what's going on inside the palace. But she hears that her cousin Mordecai, she hears that Mordecai is really upset. She sends her servants out of the palace, and chapter 4 is the conversation that happens between Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai explains the situation to Esther, tells her what's gone on and the letter and all this sort of stuff. Verse 8, and Mordecai tells Esther in verse 8 to go to the king and to beg for mercy and to plead for her people. But Esther comes back to Mordecai and explains it's not that easy. She says, verse 11, all the king's officials and even the people out in the provinces know, listen to this, that anyone who appears before the king in the inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. She says, and the king hasn't called for me to come to him for more than 30 days. Right? They live in a world where if you go and see the king, you die instantly. That's just the law. If you see the king, you die instantly unless the king holds out his scepter and says, no, they're not going to die. They can talk to me. She says, and the king hasn't asked to see me for a month, right? This is not good. Mordecai responds to her, verse 13, and says, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. And then he says, who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Mordecai says, who knows, Esther, maybe this moment is the reason that you were made queen in the first place. So now Esther's got a decision to make. Does she speak up and risk her life or not and maybe still risk it? What would you do? I mean, put yourself in that. What would you do? Do you go see the king or do you not? This is what Esther does. She asks Mordecai to pray for her for 3 days. She said, would you pray? Would you just stop whatever you do and just pray for me for 3 days? She says, and then in verse 15, and then, though it's against the law, I will go in and see the king. And if I must die, I must die, she says. Now the story starts to get pretty complicated in chapter 5. Esther takes the deep and courageous breath and she goes to see the king. And massive relief, the king is happy to see her. He extends his golden scepter and she doesn't get killed instantly. In fact, the king's so happy to see her. Apparently she looked pretty good, right, on the day. The king's so happy to see her that he says, actually, what do you want, Esther? In fact, this is verse 3. What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it's up to half the kingdom. Most powerful man in the world says to Esther, ask me for anything you want and I'll give it to you. Esther responds with this clever plan. Verse 4, she says, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman, who's the two I see, remember, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I've prepared for the king. It says, come to a dinner party that I'm putting on, bring Haman, and then I'll tell you at the dinner party what I really want. The drunken king loves a good party, so he's up for it. He goes, he takes Haman, and at the dinner party he repeats his offer. He says, right, we've had a good night, what do you want? And Esther says, I'll tell you what, come tomorrow to another dinner party. We're going to, like, one day's not enough. Come tomorrow to another dinner party, and then I'll tell you what I want. Now just imagine how pumped Haman is at this moment, right? He's like, the queen is having a dinner party and she's invited 2 people, the king and me. He leaves the palace on a high. He's had a great night. He's super excited. Chapter 5, verse 9. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate on his way out of the palace, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. And Haman goes home and he rants to his wife and his friends who are at home. He rants about this Mordecai guy and how he's not paying him respect and what's he going to do about him. And his wife and friends come up with a great idea. Verse 14, they said, set up a sharpened pole. Remember the sharpened pole thing? There's a lot of repeated imagery that comes around in this story. Set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet, 23 metres high in the front yard, and ask the king to impale Mordecai on it, right? Like some bizarre flagpole in the front yard. This is a great story. You guys should read the Bible more, right? This is awesome. Chapter 6 begins with another amazing coincidence, maybe the biggest coincidence of them all. Because that night, in between the dinner and Haman going to ask Mordecai, it says, this is chapter 6, verse 1. That night, the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring him the book of the history of his reign. Remember that book that was mentioned earlier on? So that it could be read to him. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who had guarded the door of the king's private quarters. They'd plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. Remember that whole story? And the king said, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. Right, the king can't sleep, so he asks people to bring a book to read, a book about himself, because who doesn't want to read a book about themselves if they can't sleep? And in the book, they retell that story of Mordecai and the assassination and whatever. And the king's like, did we reward that guy? We should have done something for that guy. That's a pretty, he saved my life. What did we ever do for that guy? And the king says, verse 4, he says, who's in the outer court? Right? The king's in his private chambers in his bedroom. He says, of all his officials and people around him, he says, who's in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, there's another crazy coincidence. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he'd prepared, right? So the attendants replied to the king, Haman's in the outer court. King says, bring him in. So Haman came in and the king says to him, what should I do to honour a man who truly pleases me? Right? So Haman thinks to it, I'm reading to you what's in the Bible, right? So Haman thinks to himself, who would the king wish to honour except me? King must be talking about me. So Haman replies, if the king wishes to honour someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a king that as well as a horse that the king's ridden, one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes of the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honour is dressed in the king's robe and led throughout the city square on the king's horse. Have the official who's leading the horse shout as they go, this is what the king does to honour someone. Can you picture it? Right? Excellent idea, the king says to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse just as you have prepared for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave nothing out that you've suggested. And so Haman has to take the robe and put it on Mordecai, and he has to put him on the king's horse, and Haman himself spends the evening walking around the city shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honour. And afterwards, this is what it says, verse 12, afterwards Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. What a crazy coincidence, right? But Haman can't stay dejected for long. Remember, he's got part 2 of the Queen's dinner party to get to. So he puts on his party clothes and he heads back to the palace. Chapter 7 begins with Haman heading back to the palace. It's another cracking night, and the king asks Queen Esther again, what do you want? Anything, remember? Anything. And Esther replies, this is chapter 7, verse 3. If it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. Chapter 7, verse 5. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes asks. And Esther, it is like a melodrama, and Esther, in her drop the mic moment, in the middle of the dinner party says, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. And the king goes into a drunken rage. He storms out of the room into the garden to think about what he's going to do. Because remember, no one knew that Esther was a Jew. So no one knew, not even Haman knew that when he came up with this great idea to get rid of Mordecai and all that, he had no idea that he was signing an execution order for the queen. Haman realises he's in deep trouble now. Story says that Esther's lying on the couch after dinner, reclining on a couch after dinner. And Haman throws himself at the queen to beg for mercy, right? Kind of throws himself sort of on the couch with her, please, 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 please. And in another coincidence, the king comes back into the room just as he's throwing himself on the couch with the queen, right? So what does the king? The king thinks not only, now you're like attacking the queen, so the king goes into rage times 2 and gives an instant order for Haman to be executed. And the king's attendants, what do they say? Well, there is this 23-metre high pole sitting in Haman's front yard. This is true. So they take Haman out there and they impale him on the pole in his own front yard. Verse 9, then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. It's chapter 7. So at the beginning of chapter 8, Haman's impaled on a pole, Esther's in the good books with the king, Mordecai's been celebrated for saving the king's life, and they all live happily ever after, except that the execution date for all the Jews is still circulating around the whole kingdom. People are sitting at home sharpening their knives and their swords, and they can't wait. So Esther asks the king to issue another order. It's too hard for the king to kind of try and get that order back. So she says, can we issue another order? That on the same day, on the same date, can we issue another order that the Jews are allowed to defend themselves and they're allowed to kill the people that are trying to kill them? And the drunken, spineless king goes, yeah, great idea, go do it. Chapter 9 jumps to that day when both of the king's orders are set to be carried out. Chapter 9, verse 1. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. I'll spare you the gory details, but there's lots of blood. And the Jews survive and their enemies are defeated. And Esther ends in chapter 10 with Esther and the king in love in front of a sunset. Mordecai is elevated to the king's second in command. He literally gets Haman's job. There's a lot of stuff in Esther that kind of circles around, mirrors each other. And everyone lives happily ever after. Except Haman and all the other people who didn't like the Jews. They didn't live so happily ever after. That's the story of Esther. What are we supposed to learn from all that, right? Why is that in the Bible? So as you read the story of Esther, it's right in the middle. It's 10 chapters long. It's chapters 4 and 5 right in the middle that are really the critical moments. They're the moments when Esther realises what's going on. You know, when you know the right thing that you should do. You know that you should do something, take some action or speak up. But it's risky to do so. Esther's story should be an encouragement for women and for men every time you face one of those tough choices in your life. Every time you face a moment and think, I kind of know the good thing that I should do I really want to do it? Esther's story should be an encouragement to you in that moment. Maybe for you it's standing up for someone that your friends are putting down. Maybe it's doing the right thing even when it's unpopular or awkward with the people around you. Maybe it's speaking up for truth when people around you want you to lie or to be part of a lie or a mistruth with them. Maybe it's sharing your faith when you think that someone might laugh at you. We all face decisions like this every day, don't we? I mean, they're not decisions where someone's going to die, but sometimes it can feel like I'm going to die, you know what I mean? Esther's story gives us courage and hope in those moments in our lives, to speak up for what is right and to take action even when it's risky to do so. But there's an even more important lesson hidden in Esther's story. There's probably a small detail in Esther's story that you didn't pick up, at least not in my speed reading of the story. It's a little detail that's actually key to understanding the whole book of Esther, the whole story of Esther's life. There's something really unique about the book of Esther. Does anyone know what it is? Anyone pick it up? Any Bible nerdy people who, yes?
We were born for a time like this.
We're born for a time like this, yes. Anything else? God didn't do anything. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. God never speaks. In fact, Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. Throughout everything that happens in Esther's story, all of the challenges, all of the this, all of the that, when the authors wrote Esther's story, God never says a word. God appears to be completely silent throughout Esther's life. That's not an accident in the way the story's told. The author is trying to make a really important point about Esther and a really important point for us. Because Esther's life is like a whole bunch of crazy coincidences, right? I mean, she wins the beauty pageant. What's the chances of that? Mordecai stumbles across this assassination plot. What's the chance of that? The king has a crazy dream on the exact night, the only night that occurs between Haman deciding to ask for the execution and the execution happening. And then Haman happens to be in the palace at the moment where the king has to decide what to do with his dream. The king comes back in after his rage to find Haman just on the couch with the queen at exactly the wrong moment for Haman at least. This whole book is one kind of crazy coincidence after another. Or is it? Right? That's the question that you're supposed to that's supposed to sort of circle around in your mind as you read the book of Esther. Is this really a coincidence? Or is there someone behind all this stuff that's happening? We never see God. We never hear God. Unlike most of the rest of the Bible, God never appears to Esther and says, you should do this. God never shows up in a sign to Esther and says, I'm going to do that. Esther's story is supposed to make us wonder, is God still at work behind everything that happened in Esther's life? That's why the author deliberately doesn't mention God, right? He wants to get you thinking, there's no mention of God here, but is God actually at work behind the scenes in everything that's happening in Esther's life? And when Esther has to make that hard decision in chapter 4, she can't see God. She can't hear God. And did you notice she asks Mordecai to pray, but there's no apparent answer to that prayer. That's not an accident, right? The author's trying to make a point. Can you see that? He prays for 3 days and nada happens. And yet, even when nothing happens, Esther says, I'm going to go and take action. This might be the most important thing that the book of Esther's trying to teach us. Esther's an amazing young woman. She's full of courage and hope and trust. But Esther's story ought to leave us with one really big question. How will you respond when God seems silent in your life? I mean, do you see the good things that happen in your life as a coincidence? Or do you think you made them happen? You know, when you think about the family that you've got around you, when you think about your friends, when you think about your job, when you think about the place that you live, the opportunities you have, I don't know, whatever those things that if you had to make a list of all the good things in your life, do you look at that list and do you think, that's just kind of, aren't I a lucky guy? Do you think to yourself, look at what I've made happen in my life? Or do you see God's invisible hands shaping your life and leading you through life? Esther's story asks us, will you trust God? Will you put your hope in Him? Will you believe that He's in control of your life even when you don't see any of those obvious signs that He is? Esther shows us that trust and hope in God aren't just things that you think. They're not just ideas. At some point, if you say you trust God, you have to put that into action, right? That's the story of Esther's life. The story asks us, do you trust God enough to put your faith into action even when you don't get a clear direction from God to do that? Do you know what I'm saying? Do you trust Him enough to say, you know what, I'm going to do what I know is right with God, even though I prayed and I didn't get an answer? Will you speak out for truth? Will you give generously? Will you share your faith? Will you love others? Do you have the courage to do what's right even when you're not sure if it's going to work out? You haven't got one of those moments where you can say, well, God told me this and I'm 100% sure because God told me. Do you have the trust and the faith in God to just do it anyway? Remember when Esther said, if I must die, I must die? She's asked Mordecai to pray for 3 days. She's got no answer and she says, I'm going to go do the right thing anyway, and if I die, I die. The author's trying to say, this is what real trust in God, this is what real faith looks like, right? Esther was committed to action even if it didn't work out. It's the author's way of saying, will you keep loving the difficult people in your life even when they don't change? Will you keep giving generously even when your bank account is getting lower and lower and lower? Will you keep reading your Bible daily even when you don't get something amazing out of it, right? Like everyone else seems to. Will you keep sharing your faith even when no one responds? These are the sorts of questions that Esther's story is asking us. Can you see that? We're going to jump into our small groups in a moment and ask ourselves some of these tough questions that the story asks us. There are some courageous, gutsy and determined women in the Bible, but Esther's right up there, I reckon, for me. She never has a family, she never has kids. Now, this isn't a main part of the story of Esther, but some women here need to hear that you're valuable to God whether you have a family or not, right? We live in a world that often says to women, your greatest contribution is having kids and whatever. Esther's story clearly tells us that God uses women who don't have a family. There's no mention of her having kids. There's no mention of it being a deal at all in her life, and yet God uses her as one of the most powerful women in Scripture. Apart from Mordecai, as far as we know, she's got no family at all. But her story tells us that if you're a woman, or a man, but if you're a woman who wants to make a difference in the world, who wants to stand up for God in a world where no one else does, if you're a woman who wants to overcome opposition in your life, Esther's someone that you can look up to and take courage from. She's an example of a woman who did that, right? If you're a woman or a man, if you're a woman who sometimes feels like God is silent in your life, who sometimes just wishes God would tell you what to do. Doesn't he tell everyone else what to do and I'm not getting anything? If you're a woman who feels like God has forgotten you and your problems, Esther's someone who should give you hope and encouragement because God never spoke to Esther either. So in that way, Esther is a hero for ordinary people. Esther's a hero for people who don't have that amazing testimony, you don't have that incredible story of God did this in my life. Esther's a hero for people like that, for women like that, because Esther shows us that when ordinary people will trust God, when ordinary people will take a risk and speak up, when ordinary people will have the courage to take action, God can do incredible, world-changing things through ordinary people like that. That's the story of Esther.